welcome to Charting New Paths in Pre-K through 12 Education, a podcast by Solution Tree. In our authors segment, we invite our new and best-selling authors published by Solution Tree to share their expertise and valuable insights with you. Listen to this segment and add another tool in your toolbox to research the firm, classroom-ready strategies to improve student outcomes. I'm your host, Prisma Lopez-Marin. Enjoy today's episode. Hello everyone, in today's episode, the book we'll be talking about is titled From Burnout to Fired Up, Reigniting Your Passion for Teaching. This book outlines the 5 R's framework, which uses different strategies to counter burnout, as well as having the opportunity to learn how to create a roadmap to reigniting love for teaching and for learning. We are joined by the author of this book, Morgane Michael. Since 2008, she has been an elementary school educator with the Greater Victoria School District in British Columbia. Her book describes her as interested in promoting effective social collaboration, nurturing creativity, as well as building self-efficacy and establishing a culture of high expectations. You can also check her podcast out called Kindsight 101 that she launched in 2018. It's an interesting connection to the book, as some of the education leadership she has interviewed have been quoted in the book that she has recently published here with us at Solution Tree. She is also the creator of the Small Act, Big Impact 21-Day Kindness Challenge, which seeks to promote and cultivate safe and supportive school culture. Morgane, thank you so much for joining me for this episode.
Oh, Prisma, I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you so much for having me on.
Let's go ahead and get started here. Can you share more about your current role as an educator and what it's like teaching in your own school, and then just also teaching in Canada, because we are also Solution Tree Canada?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I am a kindergarten and grade 1 teacher currently, and sometimes that fluctuates year to year. I sometimes teach straight grade 1, or I will teach just kindergarten. And so essentially I'm in the classroom full time, which I know is kind of unusual for someone who's working as an author and then doing some of the speaking things that I'm doing and sort of delving into. And I absolutely love my job. I love the whole part around planning. I love curricular planning. I love connecting with my students every single day. I find that at that primary age, they are so excited about school and life in general. And we often dedicate a certain amount of time in the day to share our news and some of the things that light us up every day. And so it's always fun connecting with the kids and, of course, their families as well. And I mentioned to you before we went on air that we just recently had our student-led conferences, which were so much fun. And the first time in several years that we've had a chance to actually have our parents come into the building. And it was so magical and so amazing to see the children lead their parents through all their learning, and for the parents to witness how much progress they've had since the beginning of the school year. So that's kind of a little snapshot into my life as a teacher currently. And I think at this point, maybe what's different about Canada and the US, and again, I'm coming at it from a Canadian standpoint, is that maybe in British Columbia specifically, there's quite a bit of self sort of determination around the curriculum. And so as much as we do have very prescribed learning outcomes, we have a certain amount of leeway in terms of how we want to fulfill those curricular outcomes and some of the topics and themes that we want to delve into, which makes it possible to be very creative. And we can sort of follow our own passions, but we can also follow that best practice around inquiry-based learning as well, which is a lot of fun. So I like to bring a lot of that into my classroom and the classroom setting as well. And then the students end up being very engaged because they're excited about what they're learning about. So that's a little bit about me.
There is a difference, obviously, in the way that teaching goes as far as both the U.S. and Canada. So it's wonderful to hear it from an actual educator who's in the field every day with our students in Canada. So I do want to learn more about the Small Act, Big Impact 21-Day Kindness Challenge. How did that come about, and what purpose did it fulfill?
Thanks for asking about that, because that's something that, I've written about burnout, and that's been sort of more focused on adults. And it's so much fun. I love that work so much. But it all kind of started with the kindness effort that I started probably back in 2017 is when it really started. I had read the book Leaders Eat Last by Simon Sinek, and it's one of his lesser known titles, but basically there was a section in the book that talks about altruism and generosity. And he outlined the benefits of generosity and kindness specifically. So he said that there are these four, he rooted it in science, which I found really fascinating. And so he said that there's these four, hormones that are responsible for happiness. And so oxytocin is one of those, serotonin, endorphins, and then essentially that these hormones work in your body, that whenever you do something kind for somebody, that they sort of fire up. And then when somebody does something kind for you, those same four hormones kind of create this cocktail of happiness. And this was the interesting part that really sort of got my brain going, was the fact that when you witness kindness or generosity, that you also get that boost of oxytocin specifically. And so the cool thing about that is that these hormones block cortisol, which is the stress hormone. And it sort of got me thinking that if we could be kind, we could bust kind of the whole stressful culture, anxiety inducing, when people are unsure of their environment in that sort of psychologically unsafe place, whether it's a workspace or a school space or just out in the community in general. If we could sort of bust that feeling of anxiety and stress by being kind to each other, and we know that science backs it up, that maybe we could shift our cultures into more kind and welcoming cultures. So I took that, and I was actually on maternity leave with my son, my second child. And I started, I sort of wanted to start trying this out. And so I went to some schools that I was a teacher. So I knew a lot of principals and teachers, and did some assemblies and did some little projects where we launched something called the 21-day kindness challenge, because we knew that loosely, but it takes about 21 days to form the basis of a habit. And so I thought, well, if we were to create kindness as a habit with the goal of creating and cultivating these cultures of belonging and kindness, so that we bring down the anxiety rates, that it could be really magical. And so we did that, and it was so much fun. We had some really great projects that came out of it. We did Kindness Rocks as a whole school, which unified our entire school with hashtags and all sorts of different things. And what it did was, I think it drew an intentional sort of attention to kindness, and more than just the, and I teach kindergarten, but more than just the kindergarten variety, but like the deep showing up for people and knowing that it's good for us and it's good for the people around us. So that's in essence what it is. And I have a lot of information on my website about different lessons that you can look at or that you can engage with your students. And so that's something that I did with the Small Act, Big Impact Kindness Challenge.
So that also included students to participate in this.
Yes. And actually, that was a big part of it. So when I mentioned the piece about inquiry, this is a way to make it really meaningful. And so you can launch it as an inquiry kindness project. And so what you can do at any age group is sort of go, how can we be kind to ourselves, which is the self-compassion piece. That's a really important piece about kindness. How can we be kind to others, and how can we be kind to our world generally? And so you can even tie environmentalism into it if you wanted to, or different elements around, if there's a passion for animal safety or fighting animal cruelty, especially at that middle age level, for example, middle school, that you can delve into that and sort of pose that question, how can we be kind? And then branch off into more specific avenues. And the children can actually be the conduits for that. And they can be the ones that guide the learning. And then together you can come up with the answers, or you can come up with the projects. Now that we know different ways to be kind, how do we actually want to engage in that? And how might we show that together as a school or as a classroom or as individual partnerships? So there are many different ways that you can do that. But that's how I usually do it. And it can be really big, or it can be really, really small. It can be a one-off lesson if you want it to be, which is kind of nice. We don't always have the time to delve into these big projects.
But that's huge. That's just huge already to be able to incorporate the students because that gives them kind of an ownership of something that creates, it actually will create change within the culture of the school. So that's just in itself, that's exciting to just, people should start this as an actual thing to implement in their school. So that's
Thank
so
you.
interesting.
Thank you.
So how did you start the challenge and who was your support group in being able to make it happen?
Yeah, so like I sort of mentioned, I think I was first inspired by this book that I read, and I think sometimes these ideas come up when you're least expecting, and there's sort of an alchemy that happens when you are exposed to different ideas or different people. And I think when I think about the some of the ideas that I have in my book, From Burnt Out to Fired Up, I think a lot of it comes from exposing yourself to different experiences, novel experiences, with the goal of you don't know how that's all going to come together for you. And so that's really how it started. And then my network, which was a lot of the people that I happen to be connected to socially within my district. I've been a teacher for almost 15 years now. So I know a lot of principals, I know a lot of educational assistants, teachers, educators, people in the field who were really excited to just jump on board. And I think the biggest thing was just taking the leap and being brave enough to say, hey, I've got this idea. It might not work, but maybe it will. And just kind of going with it. And I think I tried it at different grade levels too. And I think that there were different ways. What I would say too is there's different ways of doing it. And I like the idea of the challenge being 21 days, but I think there's also within the context of that, the ability to be flexible and make it what you want it to be. The kernel that sort of drives the whole 21-day kindness challenge is just the fact that we are able to, with intention, learn about kindness, learn about ways to show kindness, and then actually put it into practice. Because I think at the end of the day, when we're teaching students social emotional learning, at the root of it is being kind to ourselves and then showing that deep kindness to other people. And that's part of all of the social responsibility pieces, the interactions, all of the lessons that we're sort of aiming toward. It's like, how can we be responsible, helpful citizens, right? And so this is sort of a practical approach to it. And like I said, I've got many different activities on my website that kind of show different ways to launch it. You can do compliment circles, or you can have different specific books that kind of teach the lesson, and then you can jump off from there. And so that's what sort of drove me to get into this whole challenge. And then and I think my network and the people who trusted me were able to kind of jump on board. And I've done it in a number of different ways ever since, in my own classroom and then in my school.
Oh, wow. But it does serve such a powerful impact because even though it is just, a 21-day challenge, it has lasting. It will stay with people. Everybody who participated, from the educators to the students, they'll remember it. It's like, oh, well, I remember this strategy or whatever they learned, and I will continue to be kind. Like, it doesn't, just because it's 21 days, that mark, it's not an expiration date. It's more of, we get to continue to be kind because we learned all of this already. That's so
That's right.
powerful.
Well, and I have just a little anecdote to add to. I have a friend named Allie Aples, and she lives in Alberta, Canada. And she started this whole initiative called the Kindness Ninjas, and that's totally hers. But we do that every year in my kindergarten class. And the whole origin of that was also, she was dealing with a really challenging class and many sort of trauma, like children from trauma backgrounds or all sorts of different things, many kids in care, like in foster care and that sort of thing. And so some of these kids were really struggling to become this cohesive unit in the classroom. And she had tried every single SEL program that was on the market and just really struggled. And they finally had another teacher come in to support. And she and this teacher brainstormed, and they came up with this kind of edgy, for kindergarten, right? That ninjas are kind of edgy. And so they decided to launch this Kindness Ninjas project, which we do now. And they have these little red headbands, and they say a kindness pledge. And together they come up with all of these kindness challenges, and they go and they sort of like bless other classes or, like support them. And it's very sweet, but that kind of thing has a lasting impact because there's sort of like this physical image of what it means and this identity that comes with it that the kids get to adopt, the students get to adopt with you, and you get to guide them through that. And I have students who still come up to me, who are much older, who are going into middle school, and they say, "Hey, Mrs. Michael, do you remember when we were kindness ninjas with you and we would sneak through the halls, or we'd, leave croissants for the staff, or whatever we do," right? And it was just memorable. And I think there's something about going outside of the everyday school kind of experience that leaves that memorable impact, right? So yeah, anchoring those moments in novelty is really important. I think that's key.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So as an active educator, like you mentioned before, and you do so much, and we do appreciate everything that you do. What did you experience that inspired you to write this book on this specific topic?
Wow. Yeah. Well, I think oftentimes when we're nearing burnout, it doesn't always look, and I say this often, it doesn't always look like you're totally falling apart at the seams. Many educators are high functioners through struggle or challenge. Not all of us. Some of us really do kind of fall apart or under function, but we all have different ways of dealing with stress. And so the way that you deal with stress may not actually correspond with your vision of what burnout is. So for me, I think I've come close to that feeling of burnout, but it looked like restlessness, or it looked like, not wanting to go into work with that same kind of energy that I might have had before. And I think that when we think about ourselves kind of within the context of education, are we excited to come to work every day? Are we excited to see our students? And I've definitely had moments where I felt sort of up and down with that. And sometimes it actually has nothing to do with the job. It could be circumstantial, or it could be, you've got a big weight to deal with at home. It could be different stressors. You could have parents that are aging, or you could have a divorce that you're going through, or you could be moving. Maybe your partner has lost his or her job. You could have young children at home, which, lack of sleep. And I will say from experience, lack of sleep and all of those things, those contribute to a feeling of overwhelm for sure. And I think if we're not able to get to that point where we can process our emotions and sort of take stock and give ourselves a little bit of time, it can lead to a sense of burnout, or it can lead to some of those more troubling outcomes like depression and anxiety and all of these things that make it really, really hard for us to be the educators we want to be. And so I would say that, definitely when my own children were really young and I was in the classroom full time and I was feeling overwhelmed, that definitely got me to a point where I was interested in reading and learning more about how do I take care of myself in a meaningful sort of research-based way? How do I bring meaning to my life that fires me up instead of maybe feeling a bit like I'm in a slog? I think sometimes when you feel that way, you get that sense of restlessness. Like I want to be looking forward to my future. Right. And so I started reading a lot. And then from that came the writing. I love journaling, and I'm not super consistent about it, but when I've got something on my mind and I need to process stuff, that's how I do it. And so I started journaling and writing, and my blog came from that learning. And then I started the podcast, and that was really exciting. And talk about sort of finding a sense of meaning. It was so great to be able to connect with like-minded educators, but also people outside of education that gave me so much insight into psychology and the way that curriculum is designed and creativity and all these wonderful topics that it gave me a really great base from which to then sort of infuse my classroom with a newfound sense of passion, I think. And then Solution Tree reached out because of the podcast. And then I was able to put some of those thoughts and the writing that I had done and the research into a book, which was super exciting. So that's sort of the trajectory of where it came from. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier in a conversation we had that some of the people you did interview, you quoted in the book because of the conversations that you did have. So what was the interview that most impacted kind of, I really need to write this book?
Yeah. Oh, wow. I think that's such a great question. I don't think anyone's really asked me that. I will say this. Back in 2017, before I even really had any business writing this goal down, I'm a really big proponent, as a slight tangent, I'm a really big proponent and advocate for writing goals down. I think that it's incredibly important. And I've written about it in the book with research to back it up, that when we write those goals down, there's something that happens in our brain that aligns us subconsciously to that goal. So we're going to end up putting a lot of energy and a lot of effort on, underneath the surface into that goal once we actually have the courage to write it down. And so I remember, much to my surprise, writing down some of the things that I wanted to do in my personal life. I use buckets kind of as a bucket analogy for my different goals. So I might have a family bucket, or I might have a learning bucket, or I might have a professional bucket around teaching and goals, or how do I want to organize my house? And there was a personal goals part. And I wrote down, I want to write a book. And there it was. And I think that just kind of stuck in my head. And I actually did write a book, and it was with a publisher not long after I wrote that. And it wasn't the book that I was supposed to write, which was actually, I think, kind of a blessing, because I look back on that time and I go, my goodness, I'm so grateful that I wasn't the spokesperson for that particular topic. It wasn't my topic of expertise. And so I think sometimes when we have a goal in mind, or we have something that's kind of a burning need, we need to sort of trust the process and understand that, and people say this a lot, and maybe it's overstated, but that whole idea of failure, it's really just a stepping stone to where you're supposed to go. It's information that says, this is not your path, moving on and keep going straight. Right. And so, so I think I always knew that I wanted to write, and I knew that this was an interest of mine. And I absolutely love coaching and working alongside anybody who has something that drives them. Like I've done podcast coaching, but I also love working with adults. And I love that feeling of helping people and inspiring them to be the best version of themselves. Because I think if we can just have someone be our cheerleader and see the strength that we already have, that we can sink into that a little bit more, and be the best teacher that we can be. Right. So that is a big part of why I wrote the book. Yeah.
And it's such an important topic, though, because there is sometimes this is a topic that educators sometimes avoid, because either they think that they are not burning out, or they simply just don't want to deal with it. I'd rather just keep on pushing, keep on going with my baton and keep running. But you have to take care of yourself. So why do you think that is? Why do you think people, especially educators, avoid this? And then how can self-reflection guide educators to acknowledge it, self-reflection of what you mentioned in the book?
Oh, this is so good, because I've met quite a few skeptics along the way, and I get it. And I think when I see that look on their face, where they're like, all right, here we go, another self-care presentation, and you see the eye rolls or whatever, and not really, right? I'm being a bit facetious, but I think, I think people do kind of go in with their arms crossed sometimes, going, this is definitely not for me. And I always kind of enter that with, if you are a skeptic, and if that is you, that's okay. And I'm not asking you to invite any practice into your life that feels inauthentic to who you are. But I think that there's an element of self-reflection that allows us to just dig in a little bit deeper into what it is that we want and need in our life, and to live our life with intention. And sometimes that resistance, or the reticence to dig deeper, is really just it's fear, right? It's fear to dig deeper into who is it that I am, and what is it that I really desire in my life. It's a scary thought when you're not quite sure, you can't put your finger on it, and it's much easier to put the wall up. So that's number one. I think also many of our educators are busy parents, or have busy lives. They're supporting people around them and their families and everything else. And within the classroom, our jobs are really, really demanding. Many of us, we are stretched right to the nth degree many times. And so I think the prospect of adding yet another thing to our plate seems overwhelming. So I think the other piece it's not just cynicism. It's also being overwhelmed already and going, I can't add anything more. You're asking me to take time for myself from where? And so I think that's what we're fighting against as well, is sort of people feeling like this is something that takes an immense amount of time and effort, and I just don't have that. And so my response to that is it can take as little as 3 minutes a day, and anyone has that, just to check in and tune into your body maybe 2-3 times a day and go, how do I feel right now? Where do I feel it in my body? And then just asking yourself the question, what is it that I need right now? And you can schedule that in your phone, or you can just ask yourself, and it literally takes 1 minute. And the more that you do that, that self-reflective piece is that knowing yourself. And when we know ourselves, we know our emotions, and then we can name them. There's this expression, name it to tame it, from, I think it's Daniel Goleman, I think. And, but the idea that once we know who we are, then we can do something with that. If we're not in a good place, then we can go, oh, let's pinpoint that and dig into that a bit. And it turns out maybe it's not that everything in your life is not going the way that you want. Maybe it's just one little area that actually would take a very small shift to change. And I think that that's what we miss when we're feeling burnt out. We feel a bit out of control. We feel like we can't sort of have any handholds or that sort of intentionality about our future. And so when you feel like that, it can be really overwhelming to even imagine a new future, or to even tune in, because you're like, how do I get handholds on that? Right. So that's an important piece of self-reflection, is just the noticing first and acknowledging where it is that you are, taking stock.
And how can someone approach that to help somebody else? I know you're supposed to take care of yourself first, and then kind of like in the airplane where they tell you to give the oxygen max to the other person, and then, or to yourself and then to the other person.
Yes.
How do you do that? How do you go about that when you do see somebody, your fellow teacher, your best friend who's also an educator in the same building, someone you really care about, a family member who's also an educator? How do you go about that to kind of, well, besides giving them this wonderful book, before doing that, how do you go about it?
You know what? It can be really tricky. And I think we become sort of a combination of the 5 people that we spend time with, right? That's something that people, the people that we surround ourselves with, we tend to rub off on each other, and our habits do. And I'm not a big fan of unsolicited advice. I don't go around saying, hey, here, I wrote this book, I've got all the answers here, because number one, I'm still working through it too. I'm not perfect. I have to sort of ebb and flow with my own, responsibilities. And sometimes I take on too much too. And so, being able to check in, being a human being first, and also modeling for the people around you that you care about, especially if you're a leader. If you're a leader in a school and you're professing or talking about self-care, but you're not practicing it yourself, you're actually sending a mixed message. And so people will follow what it is that you do, especially if you feel pretty confident, or if you hold any amount of power in a building, right? A school building. And so it's really important to model first those self-care practices, and people will see, oh, you seem a little happier, or wow, you're pursuing some interests that fill your cup. And you'll have people say, hey, how did you do that? Or you'll have people kind of watching and going, oh, I might bring some salads to work too. Or, hey, I might do Wednesday walking at lunch as well. So I would say, first of all, work on yourself, and you walk the walk first. And then if people come to you with advice, of course, and hold their hand and be there alongside them as a cheerleader, as an accountability buddy. I have a friend, and I write about this in the book. She's like my very best friend. Every Monday morning we talk for, well, the goal was 10 minutes, but we usually go about 20 minutes or so. But every morning, every Monday morning, 6 a.m., it's TGIMs. Thank goodness it's Mondays. And we talk about our goals, and we're each other's accountability buddies. And honestly, if you asked me like 5 years ago, she was one of my bridesmaids. If you asked me 5 years ago, would we be doing this every Monday? I would have rolled my eyes and laughed. Like, there's no way that this is who we were, our dynamic or whatever. But I think that's why it works, is we talk to each other and we care about each other and we support each other in the life that we want to lead. And so there's many different ways that we can do that and be supportive. But I would say you can't really drag somebody kicking and screaming into the self-care department. That you really need to just show it, and then whoever's ready and willing will do it. And sometimes it takes people longer. They want that, but they're not quite ready to take the leap. You really, I think with any kind of self-work, you really need to be ready. But sometimes it comes from that breaking point, or it comes from that understanding that you're darn close. And so I have that checklist in my book that just sort of goes through, is it hard for you to get up in the morning? Are you feeling like a sense of dread when you look forward at the day to come, the weeks to come, the years to come? Is it hard to get up? Are you wanting to call in sick a lot? Are you irritable? Are you yelling at your kids or your spouse a lot and there's no particular reason why? Those kinds of things. And if you're going, yep, maybe that's an invitation to take a look and try some strategies that maybe you've never tried before and see what happens without any pressure. You don't even have to tell anybody. You just do it. I think there's that too, feeling pressured to make a change when maybe it feels really hard for you. So you can do it. You don't have to tell people what you're doing. You can just do it for you.
Exactly. It could be just something personal that you're doing. And then if it works out to how you're at the level that you've reached, that you're excited about what you've done, then maybe share it, and then maybe not share it at all. It's something more personal to take care of yourself. So that's very true. In this book, you do include your own experience, and I really absolutely love the introduction. I got emotional when I read it about your teacher that you had, and that's how you kind of got a passion for becoming an educator. So, what was your first year like as an educator, as a teacher, and how could this book have helped you at that moment? Let's say you didn't write this book, but somebody gave it to you.
Yeah. Well, just to go back, so Mr. Graham I'll just briefly sort of update listeners a little bit on that story. So he was a drama teacher and he spoke in British accent. And he had, he spoke in metaphors. He was quite the character. He had these crazy brocade vests and that's hat that he wore, and he smoked Benson and Hedges cigarettes right outside the classroom door. And he knew us inside and out. And I will never forget that first day of grade 8 when he invited us to come in the annex. We had to he said basically that we would have to perform The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost and then learn to juggle and then perform the two simultaneously in front of our peers, which at that age, you're 12, 13, that is the most mortifying thing you could ever imagine doing. But he was brave enough to ask us to do it. And then he'd say, if you can take the 0 and not even try, or you can give it a shot. And if you fail gloriously. And I just thought that was so brilliant. And, he was just there for us in ways that were just incredible. And I remember one time in 11th grade, by this point, I had my driver's license. I walked in and I didn't have the easiest home life. Right. And I walked in and he just stopped me at the door. He must've just had, finished a cigarette or something. And he said, Morgane, I can tell that, you're going through some things right now. And he handed me the keys to his car. And he asked me to just do a little spin of the block and clear my head. And so I did. And when I returned, I was ready to come back to the classroom. And as much as we can't do that with our vehicles, definitely probably he shouldn't even have done that back then. There was something kind of unorthodox about the way that he gave and made space for us that I think any educator can carry in their heart. Right. And so, I remember at graduation, I thanked a bunch of teachers and he was at the top of my list. And I don't remember what I wrote in the letter, but I remember writing him a letter just of gratitude. And we remained friends after graduation. And then several years later, I remember him calling me up and we would go for coffee or whatever. But this particular time he called me and, we had become fast friends. And he just said, Morgane, I'm sick. I've got terminal cancer. And I remember it just hitting me so hard. He had been one of the most memorable, it gives me chills even to think about it right now. He was one of the most memorable teachers I'd ever had. And I was devastated. And a few weeks later, he called again and said, I'm going to need you to come and see me. And I knew that was the last time I'd see him. And I remember walking down, to his house, and his wife answered the door, let me in. I walked down the hallway and he was in his bedroom. And just before I entered the bedroom, I looked on the wall, and there on the wall was that letter that I had written so many years earlier. And when I think about my first year as a teacher, I knew I'd make mistakes, and I knew that it wouldn't be perfect. And I was teaching actually a kindergarten class at the time, my very, very first year. But what I knew for sure was if I could just make connections with the kids in the spirit of Mr. Graham, that would carry me through the year. That, there was no expectation of perfection, but that the connections and the care and the heart, and for the parents and the students and my, the colleagues and principal, of course, to understand and know that my heart was in it 100%, that I was giving it my best try, and that first and foremost, those students were the most important thing. That's what I carried my first year. And I think, looking back, did I know what I was doing? Not really. Like you do, but you don't. You learn so much year after year. And I think that's really important to remember as a new teacher. It's overwhelming. And there's so many different conflicting theories and approaches. And so understanding that, I think, and everybody says this, relationships, it's everything, but it really is. I think if kids understand that you hold them dear and you care about them as people first, they're going to work harder for you. They're going to give it their best try. And then I think what you get at the end of the day is sort of this symbiotic relationship where you're working together as human beings in this space for learning. What better situation could you have, right? And so that's something I carry with me now, and that's definitely something that was at the forefront of my mind in my first year, for sure. Yeah.
And it's so powerful though, because that experience that you had, I'm sure you provide for students, especially like you mentioned earlier, that these are the grades, the primary grades where you're one of the primary people aside from their parents who is influencing who they're going to become as adults to the real world. So that's just so powerful. I don't know. I'm sure that you know that, but or maybe you don't think it because it's your passion to teach these students. But this is what you are doing as well. So I think it's a full circle. When I was reading that part, and then when I realized that you the grades that you were teaching, like, well, this is what she's doing too. I don't know if you were aware, but you were absolutely making such a huge, powerful like an imprint on their future as well.
And I think that's what so many educators can do. And I think that's part of the reason that I wrote this book is I think, when you are feeling that restlessness, or you're feeling like, most of us, and the research shows most of us got into this career definitely not for the money, not even for the holidays. It's really about this ability to make a difference in a child's life, or in a family's life. And when we lose that thread, our big why around why we first started, in education in the first place, whether we are administrators, educational assistants, or paraprofessionals, or teachers ourselves, I think we need to come back to that why, because that's part of the passion. That's part of what gets us to that place where we're able to make a difference in these kids' lives. It fuels us, right? And so, when we lose sight of that, it can sort of go the other way. Yeah.
And that's a good point. This book is not just for educators, it's also for everybody else, administration, and everybody in the building who does partake in the lives of these students. In addition to that, because of the days or the things that are happening now. So many conditions that we're dealing with in today, the world events, things that are happening around the world, but also coming out of a pandemic. And I know Canada is still also being very cautious about their way of dealing or coming out of that as well. It's not over. I mean, people are out here assuming that it's over and parading, but I mean, we're still very much slowly but surely, re-engaging into the world. So what purpose does this book hold to help during changing times that educators were in the front of all of this during the pandemic, having to deal with so much difficulties, having to switch the way that they're teaching? Oh my goodness, I would have no idea how much stress and anxiety that added on to what they were already doing. This book is amazing for so much.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think the idea there's a whole chapter really around resiliency. And resiliency, it's not just about bouncing back, but it's about bouncing forward, and it's about the idea that, you know, with some certain things in place, that you get to create a narrative that makes sense for you around all of that uncertainty. Because I think generally as human beings, and I would really argue that most educators tend to be on the higher end of this, there's a need for certainty, and there's a need for an understanding of what's to come. And we've basically just come out of a couple years, and you're right, we're not at the end of it yet, and there's sort of an exhaustion around that, but where we have no idea what the next steps are. And yet we need to keep moving forward, and we are responsible for creating a sense of certainty for the families that we serve, for our colleagues, because you don't want to get a panic going in your building, right? That's contagious. And then for our students first and foremost. And so we've had to be sort of this rock, and it's really, really hard. And I think that this book serves to kind of create that sense of resiliency where there's not an element of necessarily like accepting, but sort of a surrender to, there are things that we absolutely cannot control in our lives. And it's not just in education, but it's everything. And so if we're able to create the tools to reframe the things that are possible to reframe, so the difficult narratives that exist, can we look at it through a lens that is helpful, not maladaptive, where we're able to assert a certain amount of control over circumstances, whether it's our daily routine, whether it's the things that we do with intention for our families or ourselves, and also with the words that we use to explain what's going on in our lives. It seems so small, but that whole mindset piece is enormous, and it has the power to bring us either from despair or hope and joy. And I think most of us would want to live in a place where we feel a general sense of joy looking forward, or a hopefulness. And, when we think of despair, it's sort of this belief that this is the way that things are always going to be, versus hope, which is this feeling that, it's hard right now, but I know that on the other side of this, there's the possibility of something better, or that it's hard right now, but I can find little moments of gratitude and joy, even in the context of this being really tough. And I write about toxic positivity because I think that it's a very, very thin edged line, right? Where you don't want to be telling people that their feelings aren't valid. And you certainly don't want to be minimizing circumstances because they are legitimate. But there are things within the context of that we do have control over. And we need to anchor ourselves to that, because that is honestly the only way to feel resilient in tough times. And so that's one of the chapters in this book, is all about how do we do that? Yeah.
So what should new teachers start with?
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's a few different things. So I think number one is sort of part of this would be identify some of the stressors that come to mind for you. So there's a whole long list, and I actually have a worksheet right in the book that identifies different types of stressors. And it comes, largely from Dr. Stuart Shanker's work around self-regulation for students, but then I've adapted it to work for adults, because guess what? We are essentially the same in different bodies and with a little more time under our belt, right? So when it comes to when we're stressed, we generally kind of perform the way that we would as our 9-year-old self. And so we need to take inventory of our stressors. What kind of cognitive stressors do we have on our plate? What kind of emotional stressors? Are there circumstances, that are adding additional pressure to our lives? Like, for example, right now I'm doing my master's in educational leadership, and I've got other things on the go. And I will tell you, if I've got a due date, I'm going to be dropping some of my rubber balls that aren't as important, because I know that that's a cognitive stressor for me. So I have to be thinking ahead, and I have to know myself well enough to go, I don't perform well, or I can't show up as the teacher or parent or partner that I want to be, or friend, or whatever it is. If I am expecting myself to perform at this optimal range when I've got fluctuating stressors in my life. So if you recognize that and you can go, ooh, I'm heading into a high stress time, take inventory and see, like, I like this idea of glass balls and rubber balls, right? So this idea that, there are certain balls that we juggle in our lives that are glass balls. You absolutely cannot drop them. So maybe that's your kids, or, report cards. You cannot not do your report cards. Okay. That's a glass ball, but there are rubber balls. So maybe there are certain times that you might be more active socially, and at this time, you're going to have to drop that rubber ball, the social ball. You have to put it down for a week or two, because right now you got to focus on those glass balls. So I would say that taking taking the inventory of your stressors and then trying to reduce those. And then also looking at all of your responsibilities, kind of as though you're juggling, and recognizing that some are really important and some are not as urgent. And so it's okay to give yourself permission to drop those less urgent juggling balls and pick them back up when you're ready and you have the capacity.
I don't know if you did this on purpose, but is that idea related to the activity that your teacher had you do in the drama? The drama story. I was like, wow, that's just so.
Yeah, there's kind of a juggling analogy going on here. You know what? I think it was his. I will give him the credit for that, because I think his metaphors have come back. And so I will say no, not deliberately, but I think that whole analogy of juggling has come back in my life in many ways. And I think many of the metaphors that he used, he's like this Yoda character in my life, honestly, that I didn't even understand maybe at the time as a kid in grade 8. That now it comes back. Like, he would say things like, do it and forget about it. So that's that whole practicing non-attachment thing, right? To your tasks and your outcomes and things. I didn't really know what that meant, but now I go, oh, I get it. Start a podcast and then forget about the outcome. And guess what? That's a great piece of advice. Start a blog and forget about the outcome, or whatever it is. And so I just think that a lot of the things that he professed and talked about that we sort of went, okay, and kind of rolled our eyes at, there was deep wisdom to that, like life wisdom to that. So yeah.
And it stays with you.
It does.
It does.
Yeah.
Even into your adult life. So there's huge impact in all educators in every grade. So how can this book be a tool for administrators as they guide their educators for next year?
Yeah, I've actually done a few professional development seminars specifically just for administrators or superintendents. And it's been really great because, again, when we talk back to that whole point of how do you support colleagues who are, maybe entering burnout or struggling, I think, again, it comes down to, are we doing the work that we need to be doing to model for those around us, especially if we hold a position of power, which, whether you admit it or not, whether you have a hierarchical kind of organization or not, if you're in a leadership role, your words have more weight. The actions you take have more weight than the average person. And there's so much research on that in organizational psychology. And so if you want a healthy, happy, collegial environment as a leader, it's so important to be putting these self-care and sort of reignition of passion, kind of all of those practices into effect in your own life, because then you get to sort of model the type of lifestyle that you would urge your colleagues and the people within your organization to pursue as well, right? And so I would say that it's really important for administrators, in much the same way that if a teacher is going to teach effective social emotional learning and programming to their students, well, they better be practicing those things themselves too, right? Otherwise, it's not going to come across authentically, right? And you're going to have sort of an unhealthy environment. So I would say it's really important. And I've had tremendous feedback from administrators that go, this is so important, especially as we're merging. And I have this analogy too of, we are kind of on the and, it's the pandemic. It's, we're on the endemic phase of this pandemic, and we're nearing sort of the end, and it's becoming more widespread, but maybe a little bit more minimal, the impact. And as we merge back into everyday life, that we do so with intention, and also acknowledging that everybody comes at it with a very different psychology, that this whole experience has been extremely traumatic for certain people, to acknowledge that, and that maybe it wasn't that way. Maybe for some people it was really delightful and you had all this free time and you got to delve into creative projects. not for everybody. And so having the empathy to understand that people are coming at this from so many different stories and viewpoints and narratives. And so I think as a leader, also understanding that exists, the different experiences, and they are significant and they will affect your building, right? So having compassion for that.
I was wondering, your approach, or like what is your way of expressing yourself creatively?
Okay, I love this. I love this question so much. So, definitely it started, I read the book Big Magic, which sounds very woo-woo, but by Elizabeth Gilbert, who's an author, fabulous author. And she just spoke to me directly. And so that got me started on the podcast. It got me started on the blog. The whole journey was because of her. And she said, just pick up a paintbrush, pick up something that used to bring you joy when you were young, and just do it, and be really bad at it the first time. Do that not so good first draft of the writing or the story or whatever, and allow yourself the space to not be perfect at it. In fact, perfection is like the easiest way to hide from your own creativity. Just do it and don't expect an outcome. And certainly don't be aiming for some kind of like monetary outcome from it, because that will just kill creativity faster than anything else. So I was like, okay, I can get down with that. And I started doing that. And I used to just sing and do these kinds of things. So lately, every week or so, I go over to a really good friend's house, and she's been writing songs, and then I'll sing them with her. And we're singing, we'll like jam in her garage. It's so wild. It's so fun. So we do this kind of stuff. I love writing, and any opportunity to try something new these days. And I'm not talking like crazy things like jumping out of a plane or anything like that, but soap making or weaving, or like things that I just have never done before. I love doing that. Clay work. I made a cup the other day with my sister. I went down to this studio, and we made cups out of clay. It was super fun, and stamped little messages into it. Just things like that, to be able to just play, because play is the antithesis to perfectionism. And I think in education, we get sort of caught up in needing to be perfect sometimes. And it's just a practice. It just lets you create new dendrites in your brain and new ways of doing things. And who knows how that's going to infuse your classroom in a positive way, right? When you try new things. And it also gives you a little bit of empathy for those kiddos in your class who may not learn the way that you learned. I will tell you this, there are certain things that you have to show me about 7,000 times before I know how to do it. And weaving is one of them. I'm not so good at that, I've learned. But yeah, so that's been fun, just playing.
But I think that's one of my favorite parts about the book, because I identify myself as a creative person, and I might not have been the best student, but because I didn't know that my way of learning. And I learned later on in life as an adult that I'm a creative person. So learning was different for me, and it was so hard, but because I was a different type of student. So that's also a great thing for adults to engage in being creative themselves, because like you said, that takes away of that necessity, or that almost a little bit of an obsession that we need to be perfect at everything, because your educators, or because your students see you at such a a highlight that you feel like you have to be so perfect all the time. But that's such an outlet that you need to engage in yourself, like you said. Definitely pick up your brush and just go crazy, and not have to be so specific, not color within the lines. Definitely just have your own way of being about it.
Yes. And actually, I love this idea of sort of intentionally fighting against perfectionism. Another quote by Elizabeth Gilbert, she says that perfectionism is like this haute couture version of fear that essentially tricks you into thinking that you want it around. And you don't really, because it prevents you from being all that you can be, or from just trying something and maybe not being good at it. And anybody that's good at anything has tried it tons of times, failed a bunch. It's been a big mess. And then they've found their way through, and then kind of hit their stride with their own personality. But if you stop at the failure, well, or that hiccup, or that part where it feels uncomfortable, like you'll never find out where it is that you could go with it. And if you don't understand that process as a teacher, I mean, that's learning, right? So we have to be brave enough to really engage in true, meaningful learning. And then we can see it for our students. And we are able then to be the biggest cheerleaders for them, going, hey, that's part of it. That's learning, and you're doing it. And part of it is this messy part that you can't quite put your finger on, but when you hit it, oh man, it feels so good, right? So yeah.
And giving them that space, like you said, to not be perfect. Because if you're so obsessed with it, then you don't give them room to also, maybe they have someone like me, maybe they have students who are creatives and not necessarily so practical with learning and teaching, learning the way you're being taught. That's so kind of like one way sometimes. And
yes,
it's not as inclusive. So it's important to have more of an open-minded way of teaching. So that's so wonderful. So lastly, what is your advice for anyone listening on the direction they should take in their journey? Because we have all different journeys to take better care of their well-being, especially as an educator.
Oh my goodness. I feel like I could go so many directions with this. I'd say number one is, no matter what, just as a human being, trust your gut. I think, deep down, there's a voice, or there's whatever it is, the universe, or whatever that voice is inside that tells you kind of what your next best step is. Trust that, because it's wiser than your conscious brain is. I think there's a lot of wisdom to that. So trust that and dig in a little deeper. And sometimes it'll tell you exactly what it is that you need to do. And it may not be expected. Write it down, do some journaling around that. And then I think the other piece is be willing to step outside of your comfort zone. I think nothing really worthwhile in our lives, that creates a sense of meaning, because I think deep down as humans, we're all looking for that sense of meaning that brings purpose to our life, right? Nothing that brings a sense of meaning is ever really easy or something you can dial in. And so be courageous enough to step just outside of your comfort zone. And you don't have to burn the boats, but be willing to try something that maybe you've never tried before, and be curious about what's on the other side. I think that's really important too. So that's my advice.
Thank you so much. This conversation has been so motivating, and we appreciate your time just learning about these strategies, but also definitely check the book for the research-based part of it. It definitely grasps just a more stronger way of understanding well-being, and then definitely just maybe perhaps a friendly reminder to continue, like the book says, to reignite your passion for education. So we appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you, Prisma. It's been so much fun. Thank you. Thank you.
This book is definitely another great tool for your toolbox with teaching. It's an encouraging book, and it also helps you create your very own roadmap to the next steps to further enhance your well-being. It definitely creates that each step is meticulously outlined to light the flame that might be dimmed or on the verge of burning out. This book is available on the website solutiontree.com. Look for From Burnout to Fired Up by Morgane Michael. Now for our sponsor message. At Solution Tree, we share your vision to transform education to ensure learning for all, and we can help you make this vision a reality. No other professional learning company provides our unique blend of research-based, results-driven services that improve learning outcomes for students. All right, we appreciate you tuning in. Make sure to navigate to our solutiontree.com/podcast page to listen to our other episodes. There you can also subscribe to the podcast. Just click on the subscribe button. And then we also encourage you to remember to like our episodes and subscribe to our YouTube channel. This has been your host, Prisma Lopez-Marin. Thank you so much for joining us for Charting New Paths in Pre-K to 12 Education.